Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you all to take your seats, and those who are hesitating around the doors to come through the doors and find a seat. And you will enjoy it very much if you're able to come, because we have four superb speakers for this fourth plenary, all of whom have made very serious efforts to be with us through to and including this afternoon and early evening. The overall theme of the Manama Dialogue this year is multilateralism in the Middle East. There's been a little bit of talk about minilateralism in the Middle East, given the proliferation of what the Chinese might call small circles, trilateral, Quad, other arrangements, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, but increasingly also in the various component parts of the Middle East, as there's been an appreciation that very large institutions are sometimes difficult to manage, and as I mentioned last night, strategic autonomy too difficult to achieve, and therefore ad hoc coalitions of the willing, strategic special purpose vehicles might even style them, are in creation. But there's still a need for wider multilateral cooperation where possible, and reference to the institutions that have in the past served the region very well, and to discuss that range of issues and to reflect also on the contribution that their own organizations or countries can make to the multilateral objective. We have Dr. Nayef Al-Hajraf, the Secretary General of the GCC. We were delighted to receive him last year in December at the Manama Dialogue, where even before vaccinations, we managed to have a COVID-secure in-person dialogue, and I'm really delighted that that experience was good enough for him that he's returned and paid us the compliment of coming again. It's a huge honor and delight to have the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, Sameh Shoukry. Egypt's importance to the Arab world hardly needs underscoring by me, but the Egyptian perspective on multilateralism is vital. We've received Sameh Shoukry in the past at the Manama Dialogue, and I'm glad that he has been able to organize his schedule to be with us again today. Najla Mohammed Al-Mangoush, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Libya, knows the IISS well too. She has made also extraordinary personal efforts to be with us today. And Dr. Peter Maurer, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose organization does so much to improve the humanitarian situation around the world in different and severe areas of conflict, to bring a perspective from his organization. So that's our menu for the next hour and 15 minutes. And with no further delay, could I ask first Dr. Nayef Al-Hajraf, Secretary General of the GCC, to address the Manama Dialogue. Thank you, sir.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. John Shipman and your team for putting together this very important dialogue and keeping it for the 17th session or 17th year in a row. It starts raining outside, and in this part of the world, whenever it's a raining day, it's always a good day. And I'm sure that this will be reflected inside this room. It gives me a great pleasure to be back at the IISS Manama Dialogue, which always delivers on much needed discussions and thought, especially as the world is going into so much around this region. Such discussions and thoughts like the one we had this morning is very much needed. So again, thank you, Dr. John, and your team for organizing this 17th Manama Dialogue. I would like also to congratulate the organizers on this session theme, multilateralism and the Middle East, a topic that is just the right theme at the right time. However, I would like to throw some questions before I start my remarks. Why multilateralism is always associated with security and diplomacy? Is there any limitations for that? For us in the Gulf, multilateralism is a way of life. As we are meeting today at the 17th Regional Security Summit, I am sure many of us in this room have seen multilateral initiatives succeed in so many fronts. As we can all quickly recall the regional conflicts of the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, and how we were able to successfully and quickly overcome them through cooperations both on a global scale and a regional scale. In the Gulf, multilateralism is in our DNA. The GCC itself is built on a multilateral initiative and is sustained by the commitment of member states for ongoing cooperation. Our history is filled with examples of multilateralism initiatives and policies. In time of war, yes, but also in time of peace, to fuel economic growth and solve shared challenges. Yet, so much of the state-level conversations surrounding multilateralism lives within a security and diplomacy arena, even though there are much more initiatives taking place outside these areas. But they don't get labeled as such. They don't get the same attention and don't get the same urgency. It is time to expand conversations to include other areas. It is time to approach non-conflict matters with the same urgency we approach diplomatic and armed conflicts, and commit to their success the same way that we commit to their success when there is a conflict or even a pandemic. Climate and environment, sustainability, economic cooperations and interdependence, women empowerment, developments, just some examples. These are no longer domestic or unilateral matters. These are the next frontiers of multilateralism. For example, Saudi Arabia Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative were both launched by Saudi Arabia a few months ago and are open for other countries to take part of it. The G20 summit in Rome last month, the COP26 in Glasgow to address the climate change, the COP27, which will be taking place in Egypt, 2022, and the COP28, which will be taking place in UAE in 2023, are all examples of the next frontier of multilateralism. We know multilateralism efforts tend always to succeed in matters of security, diplomacy, conflict resolutions, or pandemic, as we have seen. It is time to approach other matters with the same urgency. In the GCC, we are expanding the multilateral infrastructure that was built over the last 4 decades to include other areas and overcome more challenges. Today, in the GCC, we are approaching the developments of the region with the same urgency as one would approach matter of conflict. In a sense, you could say we are at a race. Yes, we are racing against time. Today, we are, in a very diligent way, working on growing our economies and making them competitive in a regional as well as global level. We are working together on a cross-border workforce mobility, on a flow of capital, on innovations and entrepreneurship, and power and energy, and the empowerment of the GCC citizens. None of these goals will be achieved unilaterally, and all of these goals brings benefit to member states and the wider region. So it is the new multilateralism, in which economic integration will sustain the regional security. Ladies and gentlemen, Karl von Clausewitz is a German general and military theorist who died in 1831, is widely quoted by saying, "A war is the natural continuation of politics, but with other means." Perhaps it is time to see multilateralism as the natural approach to overcome shared challenges, not just in security, but in human development, in sustainability, and in climate change. This is the next frontier of state-level multilateralism, and we look forward to a world that works together to overcome these challenges with the same urgencies the world will approach matters of conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, over the last 2 years or so, COVID-19 pandemic brought the world together and to work together. Yet, I can assure you, and I'm sure so many people within the room agree, that we still have so many ongoing pandemic that required our full and undivided attentions and collective effort. So we believe multilateralism does not threaten sovereignty. In fact, it strengthens it, it secures it, and unlocks growth opportunities for everyone involved. So if there was ever a call for modern, better, a new multilateralism format, for regionalism, for collaborations, for partnership between states and business within border and across border, then 2020 was that call. A platform like this is what we really need. We need to share ideas and thoughts. We need to identify common challenges and create better understanding. We need to believe in our collective effort. We need to fulfill our moral and historical responsibilities and obligations toward the future generations. So let's wait no more. There is no better time than right now. Thank you, Dr. Chapman, and thank you all for your time, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General, for, if I might summarize in this way, your urgent call to diversify multilateralism in order to build resilience and also to deal with the two most important transnational threats to our security, climate change and various forms of pandemic. Foreign Minister, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the floor is yours.
In the name of God, Excellency Mr. Abdul Latif Zayani, Mr. John Shipman, Excellencies Ministers, Excellencies representatives of the delegations, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to renew my praise and thanks for the remarkable efforts that are paid by the Kingdom of Bahrain in organizing the Manama Dialogue. It is a dialogue that is really highly appreciated and has a huge interest at both regional and international levels. It has become a very important platform for exchange of information and ideas with the international community within transparency. Ladies and gentlemen, as it is said, necessity is the mother of invention. And since ancient times, whenever the human being faced challenges or threats, they innovated for themselves and the surrounding some new things to confront the fears and to guarantee their security, to enhance their well-being. This has been the case since antiquity, and it has always been the title of development throughout history. In fact, the emergence and development of international and regional organizations was only a link in the change of such development. We can clearly trace this matter since the emergence of the League of Nations with our forefathers in response to the horrors of World War I, then its development by our fathers' generation after the Second World War, and it has now become the most important international system because they have created the United Nations, its charter, and its mechanisms. This coincides also with the emergence of regional action systems, starting with the Arab League of States and the African Union and the European Union. In fact, each of these organizations and gatherings came as a product of the circumstances of its inceptions and the challenges of its environment and the surrounding, whether in terms of priorities or work tools and mechanisms. In fact, the experiences of collective international action when the will of the members was united to work together for the benefit of peoples and to serve humanity, in fact, they proved that they are feasible and they are central in several stages. Among the examples, we find the roles of the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council in settling international and regional conflicts and the contribution of peacekeeping forces in conflict areas, along with the role of the United Nations organizations and agencies providing humanitarian and relief aid, medicine, vaccines, supporting women and children, and different other topics that affected fragile and vulnerable conflict areas everywhere in the world, including, of course, the Middle East and the African continent. The Arab League of States has also, since its foundation in 1945, has played a very important role as the first regional organization that was established in the post-World War II. It played a pivotal role in promoting cooperation and supporting regional stability since it supported the independence and the liberation of the Arab countries from colonialism. It also contributed in containing many Arab crises and settling disputes among its members. But still, we must admit that in parallel to these successes, the UN system faced different obstacles. It also witnessed significant failures. Some of them were fundamental and grave, to the point that they caused disappointment with multilateral actions. And it led to questioning its justice and efficacy. Maybe the most important example of this in our region is the course of international dealing with the Palestinian issue. In fact, the multilateral system has failed to rid the world of the danger of nuclear armament. It is also not able to find or impose just solutions to a number of armed conflicts. It was not able to achieve due justice in distributing the burdens of climate change, nor distributing vaccines, nor other issues that are related to the Sustainable Development Agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, the development and the continuity of life inevitably means the development and change of challenges. Therefore, today's challenges are radically different from those of yesterday. After the threats were mostly military, and related to the issues of cooperation for development, here we are today facing an escalation in the risks associated with cross-border in a multifaceted and multi-branched way. Terrorism, namely, that is working day and night on fragmenting societies and demolishing the concept of national states in favor of promoting ideas seeking to return the societies to the narrow and close identities, insisting on turning back time, working on deviating the priorities of our society, channeling the energy of our youth from development and prosperity towards self-destruction and the destruction of their own states, leading them towards hatred and hatred of the other, destroying everything that may push humanity forward. Facing these modernist tools that are really deceiving, facing this ubiquitous capacity in financing and recruitment, facing this capability to hide behind high tech, it is of great importance to unify all international efforts to confront such terrorism in a serious and resolute manner, to dry up its sources and to protect humanity from it. Today, we are also facing the challenge of climate change, which is no longer just a scientific theory. It has become a tangible reality that we are living on a daily basis. Here we are witnessing desertification, deterioration of land quality, water scarcity, rising temperatures, with all the resulting rise in the sea and ocean levels, the threat to the coastal areas, along with all the implications of such variables on economic development, on food security, and all the conflict that we have over the scarce resources that may amount to become a threat to peace and international security. Later on, the coronavirus crisis came to throw unimaginable burdens on the global health situation for humanity and to represent an unconventional, lethal threat to the entire humanity without any discrimination. In fact, challenges are different. Thus, human solidarity and coordination to overcome such challenges is mandatory and even feasible. So, in addition to the previous challenges, we have new problems like illegal immigration, cyber and digital security, artificial intelligence challenges, genetic modification, space security, and many new daily challenges. They are global and human in nature. They cannot, and it's not possible for a single country or a group of countries or even companies that are that have technical excellence or economic excellence. They cannot be the sole decision makers in finding solutions to these issues. This is why the question that arises: what should we do facing all these developments and these challenges along with these threats? What's the role of these multiple international and regional organizations? How can this relate to the roles of maintaining regional security? In my opinion, answering these questions is simple in terms of form, but it involves many complications and challenges in the content. Currently, there is an international recognition of the need to develop and to update the international regional multilateral frameworks, both in terms of concepts, form, and mechanisms of action. Maybe, and to face all these evolving challenges, we need to evolve our multilateral system of actions. We need to go back to the founding values of the United Nations that are stipulated in the Charter and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We also have to admit that it is illogical to stay with the current structure of the United Nations that has remained unchanged since the 40s of the previous century. For example, the Security Council does not really reflect the true geographical distribution of the global system, and the African continent is really suffering of unfair representation. This needs a review of the concept of the right of veto. At the same time, we need to adopt new priorities and new topics on the international agenda, responding to emerging and non-traditional challenges such as conflicts over limited natural resources, transboundary rivers, issues of migration and unemployment, the need to find also more space for intergenerational justice in international decision-making through listening to the generations of young people, listening to their priorities, taking their opinions in matter while drafting the decisions of the international and regional organizations, because we need to recognize the right of these generations to participate in making the world that they accept and they would like to lead. The international multilateral system will have to prove its ability to evolve in different areas like internet governance, cybersecurity, AI, space security, medical technology, namely genetic engineering, so that they offer humanity a safer world facing these challenges. This does not mean that we have to put the issues and the priorities of armed conflict, disarmament, fighting hunger and poverty behind us, not at all. The responsibility of the multilateral systems towards these essential issues remains continuous. This is why the multilateral system also has to respect the universality of working to provide and protect human rights within a comprehensive concept, and to ensure that all peoples of the world enjoy their rights guaranteed by the international conventions respecting their human dignity. In fact, there is no room for continued attempts to selectively deal with human rights issues, nor to try to use them as a tool to achieve political goals. Rather, we need to have a model based on objectivity, impartiality, and avoidance of selectivity and politicization, a model that provides assistance to countries to enhance their efforts in fulfilling their obligations away from any stigmatization or defamation. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the success or failure of multilateral action, international or regionally, in facing the previous mentioned challenges will have a direct impact all over the world. However, all depends on the political will among the members of the international community, individually or collectively, for them to raise the values of justice and cooperation. It is not possible to formulate the future based on the literature of managing international relations that prevailed in past eras. So if these previous eras were based on rivalries, the challenges threaten the continuity of humanity. This is why it is important to have a multilateral system that is based on the realization that our destiny is shared and that respecting differences and privacies enriches our capabilities, increases our chances of success, and our way forward towards a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Foreign Minister, for your call for a multilateralism relevant to today's challenges. I note also your call for repairing the underrepresentation of Africa in the most important of multilateral institutions. We do our best to engage those from the African continent, at least within the IISS. And with that preface, it's a delight to invite the Foreign Minister of Libya to talk about multilateralism, including perhaps multilateralism at home. Foreign Minister.
I know it's a hard task to present after a lunch, heavy lunch and delicious lunch, but I hope I will brief shortly. First, I would like to thank the Manama Dialogue for providing this invaluable space for political leaders and experts to exchange insights and for honoring me with the opportunity to participate this year. I would like also to thank His Majesty King Hamad bin Khalifa for his wisdom and foresight in hosting such a significant event, and also my colleague, Dr. Abdulatif bin Rashid Al-Zayani, for this wonderful organization. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Kingdom of Bahrain, led by His Majesty, for their persistent support for my country at its embarks on a journey towards stability, democracy, and prosperity. I'm invited here to speak about changing multilateralism and religion security in my capacity as a foreign minister of Libya. However, I am fully aware that my contribution today has been shaped by what I have gained through academic research at graduate school about conflict resolution and peace building, and also through the fieldwork that I conducted not only in Libya, but in other countries like Syria, Iraq, and other countries. The accumulation of both my political and academic experience have allowed me for my reflection here today. Nonetheless, Libya's presence in this dialogue is important because we are suffering from most of the issues have been addressed today. We are witnessing firsthand very uncoordinated multilateral interference in our country, which in turn has escalated the local as well regional insecurity and instability. Solutions have been offered in the past and are still being offered. These solutions are usually superficial, quick fixes, which lack long-term strategies to make them sustainable. The nature of our conflict in Libya and the region require both innovation and realism. It requires holistic strategy and realistic expectation of the many and way and times necessary for this implementation. Conflict resolution, all standards answers, it needs to take in consideration local tendencies and customize accordingly. Allow me to pose this basic question. Why does conflict occur in the first place, and what is the best way to end it? Conflict in our region generally and in Libya specifically occur obviously because many complex reasons related to economic opportunities, political, ethnicity, identity, and religion ignorance. A conflict arises when individual or group advocate for what they perceive as their rights, and they usually act from economic inequality, political division, and identity conflict. Even when we talk about terrorism as a phenomenon, it's an extreme manifestation of one of all these factors. To be more specific, when an individual or groups feels that they don't have equal economic opportunities, no jobs, no financial outlook, they will be provoked to seek fulfillment elsewhere. In Libya, if young men who have picked up guns as means to feel financially secure would find a job, a future with better living prospects, they would without doubt drop their guns and opt for peace. Once the basic human needs of these conflict marks are fulfilled, they themselves will appreciate and advocate for stability in their country and region. As far as political division is concerned, sadly, Libya is a perfect example of how a country and people can be polarized by different leaders who not necessarily have the best interest of the country in mind. They feed on fear, demonizing the other, defining people according us versus them, to instigate the conflict. Political divisions are created and reinforced by leaders to solidify their position. Deep polarization and sharp divisions are in fact functional of increasing cohesion, reducing tendencies, and decreasing internal criticism of leaders. It works perfectly for these leaders, but sows long-term political and social division, which are difficult to overcome. An effective tool to help escalate political division in the political manipulation of identity, using identity politics to deepen the division amongst people, added fuel to the fire and makes the path toward peace all more difficult. In Libya, this is coupled with decades of poor education under the Gaddafi era, in which Libyans were not informed of their history and were not able to establish a national identity. In doing so, generations have suffered from both intellectual as well as historical religious gap, which affected their identity. making them easy prey for extreme identity politics, where there is a deep long-term fear and direct experience of violence that sustain an image of enemy. People are extremely vulnerable and easily manipulated. A clearly defined enemy and the perception that the group's survival is at stake inspire unconditional support of the group at all costs, through the idea that if we do not dominate, we will dominate us. Actually, people who see a situation differently are viewed by the other as obstacle toward achieving their goals and must be eliminated. So as I mentioned, the reasons of conflict are quite complex, but without addressing the root causes of the conflict in every individual country, it's impossible to navigate a way out of it. So how do we end conflict? What we do know is that traditional diplomacy, shortcuts, and even force are useless when it comes to conflict resolution and peace building. As previously mentioned, we need long-term, innovative, and realistic strategy. These can be achieved, in my opinion, through dialogue alone, because conflict produces deep division, disallowing the achievement of common purpose. Dialogue is imperative not only to resolve immediate conflict, but also to address historical divisions between members of the society. It brings people together to reflect on common ground and inspire community patterns. Peace building is about seeking and sustaining a process, not exclusively about sustaining outcomes. Rebuilding societies torn by war requires rebuilding relationships and finding new ways to be in relationship. What we are trying to measure, therefore, is not a static outcome, but a dynamic process. Also, peace building requires change across multiple levels and perceptions. We must understand, create, and sustain the space of change along a continuum which include personal, relational, and structural, and even cultural dimensions. This is doable through intensive and open dialogue with all parties involved. To speak specifically of my country, once we are in position to understand the economic needs of our people and satisfy them, we will have led the conquer stone for peace. The government of national unity has recognized its significance, and since taking office last March has launched a total of 372 economic and infrastructural projects all over the countries under the umbrella of Return to Life, عودة الحياة, to improve the economic and living conditions for our people, especially young people. This is no doubt good for the short time since we have been in office, but of course, more needs to be done. Also, if we can reinforce a positive national narrative through one political leader whose message is relevant and reliable by all Libyans, and if we are about to reinforce Libyan identity by educating Libyans about their history and their country, we will then eliminate the roots of the conflict and be able to take concrete steps toward a sustainable peace. My country is going through very critical times, and if we ignore the indicators and preach theoretical solution, put in place leaders who do not represent all Libyans, this will only increase the conflict and widen the divide. Our challenge is to find both a strategic as well as a practical approach and establish an infrastructure of sustainable transformation. In conclusion, I know that we are not impaired by lack of resources if we choose to invest wisely and patiently in peace. If we use dialogue with both tolerance and perseverance, we only limited only by how far we are willing to cast our vision. We must not despair in the depth and breadth of the challenge, rather rise to meet it for the sake of our country and people. Thank you.
Thank you, Foreign Minister, and in
شكراً.
particular for your reflection that an informed and educated understanding of national identity is a precondition for a form of national harmony that would prevent future conflict. Our best wishes for that task. Peter Maurer, the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who runs an organization that is implicitly multilateral and does so much work in this and other regions of the world. Peter.
Thanks a lot, John, colleagues, excellencies. From my side as well, a big thanks for having me again here at Manama and for the great hospitality experiencing this time again. When I addressed this summit last year, my main message centered on the imperative to include a human perspective in discussions on security. The influence of states on broad issues of security or stability, whether through multilateral, minilateral, or bilateral cooperation, is a critical factor of whether humanitarian suffering is exacerbated or eased. I have been encouraged over the last 24 hours to hear my co-panelists here this afternoon, but also the address of the Minister of Defense of Indonesia yesterday evening, which highlighted the importance of delivering social services to people in order to get to stability. At the International Committee of the Red Cross, we see the devastating humanitarian impact when wars are fought in violations of the law without mercy and humanity, and we see the massively destabilizing effects of uncontained violence. Protracted conflicts are damaging entire social systems, essential services and economies, and they profoundly destabilize societies. Vicious cycles of violence lead to protracted conflicts. We have been for decades in Iraq, Yemen, or Afghanistan, just to mention 3 cases. This highlights the failure of the international system with all its structures, procedures, mechanisms, and institutions in addressing the complexities of peacemaking. These decades of war and instability shatter nations, from immediate impact of the hostilities to the decay of infrastructure and social systems. They lead to losses of legitimacy for state-based systems within countries, and even more so in the international multilateral arena. Our work is a good example for the intricacies with which the international system struggles today. ICRC works to protect people's lives and dignity, and our mandate even extends further than the delivery of emergencies, aid and services. But while humanitarian assistance will help people survive, it is not enough to break vicious cycles of violence. We work through the mandate provided by states in the Geneva Conventions and in other frameworks governing the use of force in situations of conflict, changing the behavior of belligerents to limit the impacts of war, to protect civilians, and break endless cycles of retaliation and retribution, engaging with all sides in a conflict as neutral intermediary and on humanitarian issues is often an important first step and creates the basis for negotiations by political actors, and given the dimension of problems, these negotiations most of the time must be multilateral. Humanitarian action is neutral, independent, and impartial, but it is also operating within the broader ecosystem of societies. In the Middle East, the ICRC has seen how multi-layered crises have followed in the wake of large-scale conflict, from financial collapses, contested governance, breakdown of essential services, climate shocks, tens of thousands missing or displaced, and communities marginalized. We see these impacts in many places around the globe. Afghanistan is the latest case in point. There, a collapsing economy and faltering financial flows threaten lives and livelihoods. The stability and security implications are concerning. To focus solely on the impacts on the health system, ICRC is highly alarmed that countrywide healthcare infrastructure is at risk of imminent collapse. Humanitarian action is filling the gaps, but it is not enough. Structural problems require structural responses. We rely on the international community and its efforts at all levels, whether multilateral, minilateral, or bilateral, to show leadership based on the needs of communities. Obviously, the present structure as they exist are too often ineffective and new grand designs really not in the pipeline. This is the moment to explore new forms of multilateralism, often more ad hoc, volatile, regional, or sub-regional, sometimes more issue-driven than contextual, sometimes more a sequence of bilateral than real multilateral relations, and often still unstructured. I think that's what we are observing at the present moment. In such an environment, there are three areas where leadership is particularly needed. Firstly, the norms and principles on which the international system is based need greater adherence. Today, parties to some conflicts continue to flout the most basic rules of international humanitarian law on a scale that is cause of serious global concern. We see attempts to circumvent the law, narratives which blur the armed conflict threshold or deny categories of people humanitarian protection. There is an urgent need to unequivocally reject such misconceptions. International humanitarian law as it is, law is for all affected by conflict without exception. It remains a powerful guide in balancing military necessity against the humanitarian imperative. It recognizes the use of force as a legitimate tool in armed conflict. It provides rules to guide the application of force, ensuring legally compliant operations and reducing humanitarian consequences. I remind you that the Geneva Conventions are based on customary rules codified by militaries and universally agreed by states. My main point here in this discussion on multilateralism is, while one may at times argue whether bi, mini, or multilateral methods are more promising, my point is any international system needs some normative framework, and the Geneva Conventions are such a key feature of a universal normative infrastructure for multilateralism. My second point today, and my second area is that I would like to highlight is the power that states have to use their influence to support the law and humanitarian principles through their partnered operations. Wherever there is influence, there is a possibility to make a difference. This is perhaps every more important today in the absence of strong multilateral action and stalemates in the Security Council. The numbers of states, multinational and non-state actors involved directly or indirectly in conflicts has escalated over the last decade. More than 1/3 of non-international armed conflicts today involve coalitions of states or non-state armed groups that are parties to conflicts. The greater the number of actors involved in a conflict, the more difficult it can be to achieve political solutions. Each time an alliance is formed in a war zone, a bond is created that has the potential to increase or alleviate human suffering. When armed actors fight alongside each other in loose coalitions with unclear coordination, the result can be diffusion of responsibility that heightens the vulnerability of civilians. Yet, support relationships between armed actors also offers opportunities to strengthen the protection of civilians. Actors have a responsibility to manage their support relationship towards reducing the human cost of war. It is critical that decision makers consider pragmatic ways to reduce the risk of harm, whether to protect civilians, those wounded, or those detained. We encourage all actors in support relationships to show leadership, to take greater consideration of the risk to victims of armed conflict, and to harness the opportunity to better protect that such relationship represents. The ICRC continues to develop practical support for states, such as the release of a new publication called Allies, Partners and Proxies, which contains broad guidance for militaries and others on bringing a humanitarian dimension into their partnership and engagement. And finally and thirdly, I highlighted another opportunity. The regional cooperation offers enormous potential to build stability and alleviate suffering of millions of people. In the Middle East in particular, the absence of strong multilateral organization has led over decades to only disjointed efforts to bring the many crisis situations towards more comprehensive resolution. Maybe this is the time where an overarching framework reuniting human, financial, economic, and political dimensions could be a positive formula for multilateralism for the region in the future. The underlying objective should be to put human needs at the center while working across humanitarian, security, stability, and peace-building agendas. ICRC continues to offer states our services as a neutral intermediary to work towards a humanitarian outcomes which can be necessary steps to building trust in contested situations. In the face of mounting humanitarian needs and deepening insecurity, there is much we can do to work together as we build a better institutional framework for action and more significant outcomes for populations at the same time. I thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. Of your 3 points, I might just pick up the one about the international law of armed conflict and your reminder of customary international law and of the Geneva Conventions, but picking up also the theme that the Foreign Minister of the Arab Republic of Egypt made. Is there a need to modernize the laws of armed conflict to take into account what some people have styled the weaponization of everything we see on the Belarus-Polish border, the weaponization of migrant movements, and there might be a requirement for a sort of enhanced legal diplomacy to take place to refresh the laws of armed conflict, to take into account these new instruments of conflict. I leave that as a thought in case anyone wants to pick it up. We cannot allow ourselves to run much over 4 p.m., so I'll invite the people who I've now have on my screen to make crisp interventions, and then we'll come back to the panel for each of them to provide one succinct concluding thought inspired by those interventions. Baria Al-Mudin first, please.
Thank you, John, for the chance to ask questions. I have 3 questions, actually, since I wasn't able.
2 of them.
Okay, I'm peaceful. My first question is to the Secretary General of the GCC. Sir, amputating Lebanon from the Arab world grants victory to Iran. And when your brother or sister is sick, you run to the aid. So I wonder if you can enlighten us.
Thank you very much.
And my second question is to the Foreign Minister of Libya. Madam Foreign Minister, there are the upcoming elections, presidential elections, and they seem to be adding more to the division and polarization in Libya. What's your comments? Thank you.
Thank you, Baria. And now from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Faris Al-Sulaiman.
Assalamu alaikum jami'an. I have a question for His Excellency Dr. Nayef. 2 themes I think stand out from some of the discussions that we've heard these last few days. One of persistent anxiety about the US commitment to the region, and the other is from some of our Asian ministerial delegates displaying ambition to rise to the challenge of a multipolar world by establishing their own regional security framework within ASEAN. So my question is really, what are the prospects for the GCC now revitalized after Al-Ula and with growing defense capabilities to step into this same multipolar world with confidence and build our own integrated regional security framework?
Thank you very much. And also from Saudi Arabia, Prince Abdullah Al Saud.
Thank you very much. My question is to His Excellency Peter Maurer, and it's regarding Afghanistan and what promises to be one of the world's most devastating humanitarian crises. What efforts are you engaging in right now to alleviate this, and what are the challenges you're facing? You mentioned humanitarian action alone is not enough, and there are structural problems. And how can we overcome these challenges? Thank you.
And from Bahrain, Nufal Awadi.
I think a challenge that we're facing not only within the GCC as well as the Arab states in general is the P5+1 JCPOA negotiations. So as a region, we need to be involved in these negotiations, considering not only the geographical proximity, but also it as a security threat. So I would just like to ask the panel if they could comment on the involvement of the region within these negotiations.
And from Saudi Arabia again, Faisal Al-Fuzan.
Yeah, thanks, Jones. My question goes to Dr. Nayef. I would like to ask Dr. Nayef, we are in the stage of develop a strategy for the cybersecurity and cyber tourism, because the challenging in the Gulf region has changed now based on the technology, which is increased nowadays. So do you think we are in the stage to have one policy and one procedures and one guidelines for our Gulf nations? Thank you.
And from Germany, Bastian Giegerick.
Thank you, John. My question is primarily for the Foreign Minister of Egypt, and on that theme of changing multilateralism and regional security. I was wondering, Foreign Minister, whether you could say a few words about these groupings of Eastern Mediterranean and Gulf countries that have emerged involving your country, but also Greece, UAE, Israel, France, and what the contribution that those groupings might make to the solution of regional conflict could be in specific terms. Thank you.
And from the US, Mark Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. My question is primarily to Foreign Minister Shoukry and Secretary General Al-Hajraf. I wonder if either or both of you would wish to comment about the extraordinary meeting held earlier this week between Egypt, Jordan, GCC, the E3, and the United States about Iran. Was this just a one-off meeting, or might it hold portent for the kind of regional security dialogue and cooperation that many profess to seek?
And Badia, you get a refund of one question because everybody's been so good, so I've turned you on. One more question.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Ooh. I like it, John. I just want to mention something before I ask. When I talk about amputating Lebanon, I just want to say to everyone here, the Lebanese people cannot fight Hezbollah. So if it's being asked from us to go and fight Hezbollah and get rid of them, we can't. First, they're Lebanese, and we're not armed. And 70%, if not more, of the Lebanese, probably 85, do not like Hezbollah to exist anyway. So my question is to the President of the Red Cross. Sir, can you tell us about your work in Lebanon and if you're being able to meet the challenges that are in Lebanon? There is starvation in Lebanon, as you know. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I think I'll go in reverse order if I could. Peter Maurer, Foreign Minister of Libya, Foreign Minister of Egypt, Secretary General of the GCC, who I think last year at this summit called for GCC engagement directly in the Iran talks. So that question in particular, I think, falls again in your lap. I do have to stop exactly at 4 p.m., so I'm inviting each of you to restrict your remarks to 2.25 minutes. Peter, you're first.
Well, to the first question, the situation, humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, the challenges is what we can do. I think one of the particular challenges in Afghanistan is the confluence of post-conflict instability, legitimacy crisis of a government which is not recognized by the international community, financial and economic crisis, and 40 years of conflict. So you get everything at the same time. The problem is that Afghanistan was basically, social services in Afghanistan were financed by the international community for the last 20 years, up to 60, 70, even 75%. These social services stopped from one day to another, mid of August. And so, contrary to other situations where you can just substitute in building a humanitarian organization, loading goods on trucks and distributing them, Afghanistan is much more complex. And one of the first and foremost struggles that we are fighting with is that in order to maintain social systems in Afghanistan, you need to be able to pay salaries. And this is something that the international community up till now hasn't been comfortable to pay salaries and to reestablish a financial system in Afghanistan which comes into the support of a government which is not recognized. So we are trying to find soft spots between the demands of the international community, which opposes the full-fledged recognition and reestablishment of a financial system which would sustain an economic system, which would sustain social services to people, by finding an in-between way of maintaining ourselves and financing ourselves, certain salaries, being accountable to our donors, while at the same time transparent with the Taliban without necessarily money flowing through the present structures. That's an intermediate provisional solutions in order to prevent the worst. But the biggest challenge indeed is at the present moment to find a political framework in which, either with or without recognition, that's beyond my pay grade because I'm not a political actor, but outside of the question of recognition, to inject some liquidity into the economic system in Afghanistan, which entertains basic social services. If we don't do it, we will see millions of people suffering through the winter. We will see millions of people with no other alternative than either to leave, to join more radical group, or to do illegal or illicit activities, which they are not doing yet at the present moment. With regard to Lebanon, again, I have to say it's a big headache for a humanitarian organization, because Lebanon simply falls, or the humanitarian crisis in Lebanon falls outside of the crack of traditional categories. That's not a war going on in Lebanon, it's not a natural disaster, it's a humanitarian crisis as a consequence of governance failures. And I think that's the specificity of the crisis which challenge a humanitarian organization. Having said that, we try hard together with the Lebanese Red Cross Society, here again, to find scaling possibilities of basic humanitarian services to people. We have focused over the last couple of months on the health sector to stabilize as good as we can. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that it's very precarious and low-level stabilization. But I would agree with you, the needs are huge. Lebanon looks today like a major humanitarian disaster, but if we look at the origin of the humanitarian disaster, it falls outside the crack of traditional financial and response instruments of the international community. And I think that's what the World Bank struggles with, what the IMF struggle with, what the international system struggle with. For us, humanitarian, it's obvious that we have to do more, whether it is on a humanitarian or other ticket, and we try to the best possible in the key areas of food, hunger, vulnerable groups, health services, electricity services to people, to maintain the minimal services running in order to prevent the worst. But here again, scale has to come with political solutions.
Well, thank you for the question. In terms of the presidential election in Libya, as you know, this is the first time Libya has a presidential election. So it's a new concept in a fragile peace situation. We really support the election process, and we are very keen to have it on time. But also we have to be sensitive about the circumstances and how we can navigate those challenges. And I wish the luck for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Related to the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, it is certainly a representation of multilateralism in the field of economic development and replacing potential an adversarial posture for a more cooperative one, to take full advantage of the natural resources available and to create a configurations of cooperative partners that can fulfill the aspirations of the people, provide economic development, and at the same time unnecessarily protect their mutual interests, and thereby to a degree. It is conceivable that the efforts of the gas forum will also have a political as well as a security dimension as it develops and evolves and includes greater participation. The objective is a holistic approach in the region of the Eastern Mediterranean that does not exclude any members, provided that they adhere to the principles of good neighborly relations, non-intervention in the affairs of others, and a desire to actively participate in the stability and security and embetterment of the region. So we do hope that it does evolve necessarily in all of these fields in a benevolent way rather than in any adversarial or exclusive manner. As for the GCC meeting and the E3, Jordan and Egypt, this does not constitute a configuration, whether security or political. This is a matter of a desire to have a greater level of transparency in terms of how the international community, as represented in the P5+1, is dealing with an issue that has direct implications and impact on states of the region, whether the GCC or Egypt, and had always been applying for greater involvement in presenting their views and opinions as how to enhance and consolidate an agreement that fulfills the necessary security requirements, whether related to non-proliferation or the general political environment in the region. And I believe that had there been greater involvement by the states of the region in the formulation of whatever agreement was framed, we might have had better results. At this stage, I think it's important that there is a greater transparency and a recognition that the states of the region might know something about it and can create a value added that can be beneficial to those who shoulder a heavy responsibility, but one that should have the inclusion of those who are affected. I think the developments of the region has continually shown, I won't say in hindsight, but I will say, as was probably demonstrated by most, that we know the general conditions and the underlying factors, and had there been greater cooperation, we would not be the recipients of the many mistakes that have occurred and that still have a very devastating impact on our national security and on our well-being. Thank you.
Just before I pass the baton to the Secretary General of the GCC, could I just press you to follow up on one element of that answer? There is a well-known mechanism for dealing with arms control agreements. So whatever the flaws of the JCPOA or whatever the prospects for a future, there is a mechanism for dealing with arms control arrangements. There's a mechanism for adding to those arrangements if missiles need to be part of a package. There's less of a mechanism diplomatically and strategically for dealing with the other element that changes from day to day the balance of power in the Middle East, which is Iran's influence networks in the region. Coming from the region, understanding the region, do you have a particular recommendation to make for a compelling multilateral strategy to deal with Iran's influence networks in the Middle East?
Maybe I won't answer directly to your query, but it gives me an opportunity to refer to the fact that whatever we do in enhancing multilateralism, and in the areas that you mentioned, particularly since I might have some experience with the issues of disarmament, having had a long career in that field, I think we have to recognize that if we are true to the idea of a rule-based international order, we should stick to the rules and not try to manipulate them and accommodate our interests through a deviation from the rules that we have put in place and have recognized as the guiding principles, or else the whole system will unravel and it becomes, again, based on ideas of enhancing the influence and the ability to enforce the will on the basis of abilities and potential, rather than on the basis of principles and ideas.
Secretary General of the GCC.
Thank you, John. I have write down 5 questions, but I have less than 2 minutes to answer them. So I'll try to make it very quick and very brief. For Lebanon, we never abandoned Lebanon. And no one can underestimate how much the GCC collectively and bilaterally have contributed to the stability and for the people of Lebanon, of whom we are very much attached. And we don't have a problem with Lebanon, but there is a problem inside Lebanon. And this problem, everyone's seeing it, except the political elite. So I think this is a domestic issue that needs to be addressed within the Lebanese people. For the B5, you ask about the B5+1 and the JCPOA, and I think I would like to take the opportunity just to highlight where do we stand in this regard. The 2015 nuclear agreement was welcomed by the GCC, but it was introduced at that time that this will modify the behavior from the Iranian. In fact, if we run just a quick comparison between 2015 and 2021, we can see exactly whether it has been modified or whether it's become more aggressive. And of course, we are demanding for longer and stronger. Of course, the sunset clause is not enough. And there is a historical evidence with the nuclear program of North Korea. Those who were sitting on the negotiation table were the US, Russia, China, Japan, and South Korea, which is the neighboring country. Now with the JCPOA, the B5+1, discussing an issue. Now for Vienna talks, now they are getting into their 7th round of negotiation. Nothing has been materialized yet. We have our own concerns, legitimate concerns, that the negotiation should not be limited to the JCPOA. It should include the Iranian behaviors of destabilizing the region, which is very important. I think everyone felt that's aggression. We've seen the Iranian interventions in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. And we have seen the daily attack, Saudi Arabia, by the Houthis, a group supported by Iran, supported by Iranians' missiles as well. And I think that cannot be overlooked. The JCPOA should be very comprehensive, and we thank the B5+1 who try to put the effort. But we are also hoping that the other side of the table will appreciate this effort to maintain the security and peace in this region, which is very important for the peace and security for the rest of the world. Regarding the meeting that took place, His Excellency Minister Sameh referred to that, but I think this is part of the new multilateralism, because this issue will not be addressed in closed rooms. It requires consultations with partners, with major players. Egypt, Jordan, and the GCC are playing a very significant role to stabilize the region, and I think this kind of meetings will put the matters in a more transparent way, and also will open the channels to listen to all these concerns and things and ideas that will affect us collectively at the end of the day. Before that, on Wednesday, there was a meeting between the GCC and the US, and there is a statement that was issued after that meeting. I think that statement explains exactly where do we stand. At the same time, we still hope that the new presidents in Iran will address the international community concerns, and we hope that we will see more secure and safe region that adhered with international law, with the UN chart, for the benefit of everyone. There's a couple of other questions for the cybersecurity. I think this is one of the issues that Al-Ula Summit have indicated. It is at our priority, and of course, the more we expose to technology, the more we have to examine the cybersecurity issues, because it goes line in line, as well as the security and the work together within the GCC, different agencies to enhance the collective security for the member states, which has been approved. It is one, it cannot be divided, and that's what we are working on. Thank you, John.
Secretary General, thank you very much. Let me say two things. First, ask all of you in a moment to thank our four very distinguished panelists for an extremely stimulating look at the future of multilateralism and regional peace and security. And secondly, simply to say that those of you who have been fortunate enough to receive an invitation to attend dinner with His Majesty this evening, the reception followed by the dinner, including the four people on this stage, we need to leave at exactly 4:15 from the front lobby, where the convoy will proceed to the reception and subsequently to the dinner. The rest of you have an absolutely marvelous dinner and reception here. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9:30, where we have no less than 7 speakers before lunch. So rest well, be stimulated. See you again tomorrow morning, and thank all of our speakers for this tremendous session we've just had. Thank you.
When looking at the factors driving defence spending globally, not only in the Middle East, it's really helpful to group them into categories. So we look at the economic, so factors like real GDP growth, fiscal balance, in the Middle East, the oil price certainly. We also look at the strategic drivers, so the regional security threats, any particular adversaries that are needed to be countered, and then finally the political drivers, so which party are in power, what their outlook is on defence and what their priorities are. Recent trends in Middle East defence expenditure have been shaped not only by the tough economic conditions that the countries were facing coming into the pandemic, but also what's happened since the pandemic hit in 2020. When the pandemic began to impact countries in this region, they were already facing quite a tight fiscal environment because of that subdued oil price in recent years. And what countries then did to mitigate against the economic impact was to increase funding for social programs, so sort of fiscal relief efforts, as we saw globally. But that also created pressure on fiscal deficits, and we saw them widen considerably. So perhaps 2021 presents a plateauing or the end, potentially, of the more stronger cuts. I think countries are now seeing that the oil price has stabilised, so they are able to begin increasing the defence budgets again. But it does remain to be seen how the countries will now react.
This past year has been a year of relative quiet and de-escalation in the Middle East, contrary to previous ones. The coming to power of Joe Biden, the realization of the cost of the COVID pandemic, fatigue and frustration on the battlefields across the region have led to a relative détente, de-escalation in regional tensions. So there's a lot of interesting movements and some prospects for diplomatic advances, the Manama Dialogue serves as a platform for ministers to offer policy statements and explain where their countries stand on major issues. And year after year, the issue of Iran's role in the region dominates because of its nuclear program, because of its missile and UAV arsenal, because of its support for partner and militia activities across the region, and its operations in the maritime domain. So, the issue of Iran and what the US and Western powers in general are willing to do about it remains a foremost issue on everyone's mind. But it's not the only one. I mean, in recent years, and I suspect this will be the case in Manama, what Turkey's interests and calculations in the region will be discussed quite intensely. I also suspect that the issue of the Abraham Accord and Israel's place in the region will be tackled. We're all very keen to hear from Asian ministers about how they look at the region, especially after the COVID pandemic. Do they see their prosperity linked to Middle Eastern security? Are they willing to invest more? Are they willing to integrate Middle Eastern countries into their own global development plans? So that's an angle that we're all very keen to hear about.